The last golden rays of sunset kissed the endless prairie as Violet McKinnon stepped onto the porch of her modest homestead, her heart heavier than the water bucket in her calloused hands. The year was 1878, and the Wyoming Territory stretched before her like an ocean of grass, beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. 2 years had passed since she'd followed her brother west after losing her parents to influenza back in Boston, and 6 months since she'd buried that same brother after a cattle rustling gone wrong. Now the small ranch was hers alone to manage, a task that seemed more impossible with each passing day. Violet set the bucket down and sank onto the rough-hewn steps, exhaustion seeping into her bones. The cattle needed tending, the garden was overgrown, and the roof leaked something terrible when it rained. But tonight, with the world painted in amber and gold, she allowed herself a moment of respite. Almost without thinking, she began to sing a soft, haunting melody her mother had taught her long ago. It was nothing fancy, just a simple folk song about love and longing, but her clear soprano voice carried across the open land. She closed her eyes, losing herself in the familiar tune, unaware that she had an audience until a deep voice spoke from the shadows. "Don't stop. I'll listen every night if you let me." Violet's eyes flew open, her hand reaching instinctively for the small derringer she kept in her apron pocket. A tall figure emerged from the gathering darkness, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Didn't mean to frighten you, madam," the stranger said, stepping into the fading light. "Name's Keaton Dawson. I was just passing by when I heard your singing." He removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked brown hair and eyes the color of warm whiskey. "It was the prettiest thing I've heard since crossing the Mississippi." Violet kept her hand on the derringer, studying the man before her. He was trail-worn but clean, his clothes dusty but well-kept. A cowboy, judging by the worn leather chaps and the way he carried himself. "You're trespassing, Mr. Dawson," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "This is private property." "My apologies," he replied, making no move to come closer. "I'm looking for work." "Heard the McAllister outfit might be hiring." "McAllister's place is 10 miles east," Violet said, relaxing her grip on the gun slightly. "You're a ways off course." Keaton nodded, a sheepish smile crossing his weathered face. "Wouldn't be the first time I've lost my way, been riding since dawn." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Mind if I water my horse before heading out? He's just over yonder." As if on cue, a chestnut gelding nickered from where it was tethered to a cottonwood tree. Violet hesitated, weighing caution against courtesy. "Water your horse," she finally said, "and then be on your way." "Much obliged," Keaton said, placing his hat back on his head with a slight tip in her direction. As he turned to retrieve his mount, he paused. "That song you were singing, my grandmother used to sing something similar." "The Rose of Tralee, wasn't it?" Surprise flickered across Violet's face. "You know it, only pieces," he admitted, "but I'd sure like to hear the rest sometime." His smile was warm, genuine, and for a moment it eased the loneliness that had become Violet's constant companion. "Perhaps another time, Mr. Dawson," she replied, her tone softer than before. The pumps around back. As Keaton led his horse to water, Violet returned inside, lighting a lamp against the encroaching darkness. Through the window, she watched the tall cowboy speaking quietly to his horse, a gentleness in his movements that belied his rugged appearance. Something about him stirred a feeling she couldn't quite name, a dangerous thing for a woman alone in this unforgiving land. When he rode away, Violet told herself it was relief she felt, not disappointment. She had enough troubles without adding a wandering cowboy to her list. Still, that night as she lay in bed, she found herself wondering if he would find work at the McAllister ranch and if their paths might cross again. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the spring air carrying the promise of coming summer. Violet was up before the sun, her routine unchanging despite the lingering thoughts of the stranger from the night before. The cows needed milking, eggs needed collecting, and the endless mending awaited her attention. By midday, she was working in the small vegetable garden her brother had started before his death, pulling weeds with single-minded determination. The relentless Wyoming sun beat down upon her back, and sweat dampened the collar of her faded blue dress. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice the approaching rider until his shadow fell across the garden. "Miss McKinnon," Violet straightened, shielding her eyes against the sun. Keaton Dawson sat atop his chestnut gelding, looking marginally less dusty than the previous evening. "Mr. Dawson," she acknowledged, brushing soil from her hands. "I see you found your way back." "That I did," he replied, dismounting with an easy grace. "Spoke with McAllister. He's not hiring until fall roundup." "That's unfortunate," Violet said, wondering why he had returned to her homestead. Keaton removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Thing is, I noticed your place could use some attention." He gestured to the sagging fence line and the half-collapsed barn. "I'm handy with tools, good with livestock. I'd be willing to work for room and board until something permanent comes along." Suspicion flared in Violet's chest. "Why would you do that? Honest work is its own reward," he said simply. "Besides, I've got nowhere pressing to be, and you look like you could use a hand." Violet bristled at his assessment, pride stiffening her spine. "I'm managing just fine, Mr. Dawson. No disrespect intended," he said quickly. "It's just, a place this size typically needs more than one person to run it properly. Your brother, how do you know about my brother?" Violet interrupted, her hand instinctively moving toward her pocket where the Derringer rested. Keaton held up his hands placatingly. "McAllister mentioned it. Said Thomas McKinnon was a good man, said his sister was trying to keep the place going on her own." His expression softened. "That's a mighty tall order, even for someone as capable as you clearly are." Violet studied him, torn between need and caution. She desperately required help, but trusting a stranger was risky. Still, there was something in his direct gaze that inspired confidence. "1 week," she finally said. "You can stay 1 week. You'll sleep in the barn, take your meals with me. If either of us is dissatisfied after that time, we part ways, no questions asked." Relief spread across Keaton's face. "Agreed. I'll start with that barn roof, looks like it's about to give way entirely." "The fence needs mending first," Violet countered. "I've lost 2 calves to coyotes in the past month." Keaton nodded, already surveying the property with a practiced eye. "Fence it is. Point me to your tools and I'll get started right away." As Violet led him to the small tool shed, she couldn't help but wonder if she was making a terrible mistake. Yet watching him examine the tools with knowing hands, she felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced in months. Perhaps, just perhaps, this unexpected arrival might be the salvation her struggling ranch needed. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Violet found herself sitting on the porch steps once more, watching as Keaton checked on his horse before retiring to the barn. The day's labor had left him dusty and tired, but he'd worked without complaint, repairing a substantial section of the fence line with skill and efficiency. "You're staring, Miss McKinnon," he called out, a smile evident in his voice even in the gathering darkness. Embarrassed at being caught, Violet straightened. "Just making sure you're not pilfering any of my meager possessions, Mr. Dawson." His chuckle was warm in the cool evening air. "The only thing I might steal is another verse of that song." He approached the porch, keeping a respectful distance. "It's been running through my head all day." Violet hesitated, then sighed. "1 verse and then you should rest. Morning comes early on a ranch." She began to sing softly, her voice gaining strength as the familiar melody took hold. The song spoke of love and separation, of beauty that transcended distance and time. As the final notes faded into the night, she glanced at Keaton, surprised to find him watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "That was even lovelier than I remembered," he said quietly. "Thank you." "It was my mother's favorite," Violet admitted. "She taught it to me when I was little back in Boston." "Boston," Keaton raised an eyebrow. "You're a long way from home, Miss McKinnon." "This is home now," she replied firmly. "It's all I have left." Understanding passed between them, a moment of connection that needed no words. Then Keaton nodded, replacing his hat. "Good night, Miss McKinnon. I'll see you at sunrise." True to his word, Keaton was already tending to the livestock when Violet emerged from the cabin the next morning. Days fell into a pattern. Working side by side during daylight hours, sharing simple meals, and occasionally, when the work was done, Violet would sing while Keaton listened. his presence a surprisingly comforting constant in her solitary existence. By the end of the week, the fence was mended, the barn roof patched, and the cattle safely corralled. When Violet mentioned their agreement coming to an end, Keaton merely nodded and asked what task she wanted him to tackle next. Neither spoke of him leaving, and somehow, the temporary arrangement stretched into weeks. One sweltering afternoon in late June, they were working together to repair a wagon wheel when Keaton suddenly straightened, his head tilted toward the horizon. "Riders coming," he said, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Violet squinted, making out 3 figures approaching at a steady trot. "Probably just passing through," she said, though unease prickled along her spine. Keaton's expression hardened. "Get inside the house, Violet." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in his tone made her comply without argument. From the window, she watched as 3 men pulled up in front of the cabin. Their horses were lathered, suggesting a hard ride, and something about their demeanor set alarm bells ringing in Violet's mind. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Keaton greeted them, his stance casual but alert. "What brings you to McKinnon land?" The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a pockmarked face, dismounted slowly. "Looking for a man name of Keaton Dawson," his eyes narrowed. "That wouldn't be you, would it?" "Depends who's asking," Keaton replied evenly. The man spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt. "Name's Buchanan." "These are my associates, Pike and Renfro." He gestured to the men still mounted. "We're representing certain interests up north that are mighty interested in having a word with you." "What kind of interests?" Keaton asked, his hand never straying far from his gun. Buchanan smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "The kind that don't take kindly to having their cattle stolen." Violet's breath caught. Cattle rustling was a hanging offense in the territories. She watched as Keaton's shoulders tensed slightly, though his voice remained steady. "I believe you're mistaken," he said. "I've been working this ranch for the past month." "Convenient alibi," Buchanan sneered. "But we've got witnesses that place you with the McLaren gang during that big drive that went missing near Cheyenne." "The McLaren gang?" Keaton shook his head. "Buddy McLaren and I rode together years ago, but I haven't seen him since '75. Whatever he's gotten himself into now, I'm not part of it." Buchanan's hand drifted toward his holster. "That's not how we heard it." The tension in the air thickened. Violet could see the other 2 men shifting on their horses, hands hovering near their weapons. Without thinking, she grabbed her father's old shotgun from above the door and stepped onto the porch. "This is private property," she called out, the shotgun held firmly in her hands. "State your business properly or move along." Buchanan turned, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her with the weapon. Then he laughed. Well, Dawson's got himself a feisty little protector." "Miss McKinnon owns this land," Keaton said sharply. "Show some respect." "Miss McKinnon might want to consider the company she keeps," Buchanan replied. "Your friend here has a history of choosing the wrong side of the law." Violet's gaze flicked to Keaton, who met her eyes briefly before turning back to the men. "Whatever you think I've done, you're mistaken," he said firmly. "Now, unless you've got a warrant or a marshal with you, I suggest you move on." For a tense moment, Violet thought Buchanan might draw his weapon, then he spat again and remounted his horse. "This isn't over, Dawson. We'll be keeping an eye out." He tipped his hat mockingly to Violet. "Madam." The 3 men wheeled their horses around and rode off, dust billowing in their wake. As soon as they were out of sight, Violet lowered the shotgun, her hands trembling slightly. "Are you all right?" Keaton asked, approaching the porch. "Am I all right?" Violet repeated incredulously. "Those men just accused you of being a cattle rustler, and you're asking if I'm all right," Keaton sighed, removing his hat. "It's complicated, Violet." "Then uncomplicate it," she demanded. "Have you been lying to me this whole time? Are you a criminal?" "No," he said firmly, "but I haven't told you everything about my past." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "I did ride with Buddy McLaren years ago, but as ranch hands, not rustlers. We worked for the Bar T outfit up in Montana." "So why would those men think otherwise?" Keaton's expression darkened. "Because Buddy went bad after we parted ways. Started stealing cattle, robbing stagecoaches. Last I heard, he was running with a rough crowd near the Dakota border." He met Violet's gaze directly. "I'm not part of that life, Violet, never was, but my association with Buddy has caused me trouble before." Violet wanted to believe him. The man who had worked alongside her for weeks, who listened to her sing in the evenings and told her stories of his travels across the Western Territories, didn't seem like a criminal. But doubt had taken root. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" she asked quietly. "Would you have let me stay if I had?" he countered. "A drifter with questionable connections arriving at your doorstep," the answer hung unspoken between them. Of course she wouldn't have. Violet lowered herself onto the porch steps, suddenly tired. "What happens now?" she asked. Keaton looked out toward the horizon where the men had disappeared. "They'll be back, or others like them. Buchanan's type doesn't give up easily." He turned back to her, his expression resolute. "I should leave. My presence here is putting you in danger." The thought of him leaving sent an unexpected pang through Violet's chest. Despite her misgivings, the past weeks with Keaton had been the first time since her brother's death that she hadn't felt completely alone. "And if you stay?" she asked, barely recognizing the vulnerability in her own voice. Something softened in Keaton's gaze. "If I stay, we need to be prepared. Those men might come back with more numbers, or they might spread word that could bring law enforcement or worse, vigilantes." He stepped closer, his voice gentle but serious. "I won't put you at risk, Violet. This is your decision to make." Violet looked out across the land that had become her home, the place her brother had dreamed would be their fresh start. The ranch was running better than it had in months, largely thanks to Keaton's help. And beyond the practical considerations, the thought of returning to solitude made her heart ache. "Stay," she said finally. "At least until we figure this out. But no more secrets, Keaton. I need to know everything if I'm going to trust you." Relief washed over his features. "No more secrets," he agreed, offering his hand to seal the promise. As Violet placed her hand in his, the contact sent a flutter through her stomach that had nothing to do with fear or uncertainty. Despite everything, there was something about Keaton Dawson that called to her, like the distant horizon called to travelers seeking new beginnings. That night, they sat before the fire in Violet's small cabin, and Keaton told her his story how he'd left his family's failing farm in Missouri at 18, drifting west in search of work and adventure. He spoke of cattle drives and mining camps, of friendships formed and lost on the frontier. And he told her about Buddy McLaren, once a friend who had gradually been seduced by quick money and lawless living. "The last time I saw him was in Deadwood," Keaton explained, staring into the flames. "He tried to convince me to join him on a job that would set us up for life. When I refused, he accused me of lacking courage." A wry smile twisted his lips. "Maybe he was right about that. There's a difference between courage and foolishness," Violet said quietly. "Choosing the honest path when the other seems easier, that takes its own kind of bravery." Keaton looked at her then, something unreadable in his expression. "You're an unusual woman, Violet McKinnon." "I'll take that as a compliment," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. It was meant as one. His gaze lingered on her face, and for a moment, Violet thought he might say more. Instead, he stood, stretching his tall frame. "It's late. We should both get some rest." As he prepared to leave for the barn, Violet called after him. "Keaton." When he turned, she continued, "Thank you for telling me the truth." He nodded once, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Thank you for listening." After he left, Violet sat alone, her thoughts in turmoil. The danger Keaton had brought to her door was real, yet she couldn't bring herself to regret his presence in her life. Somehow, in the span of a few short weeks, this mysterious cowboy had become important to her in ways she wasn't ready to examine too closely. The next day passed uneventfully, but an undercurrent of tension ran beneath their usual routine. Both kept a watchful eye on the horizon, half expecting Buchanan and his men to return. By evening, when no visitors had appeared, Violet began to hope that perhaps the threat had passed. As dusk settled over the prairie, she found herself automatically moving to the porch, drawn by the cooler evening air and the spectacular sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Keaton joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you might want this," he said, offering her one of the steaming mugs. "Thank you." She accepted it gratefully, Their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange, they sat in companionable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Almost without thinking, Violet began to hum softly, the melody of the Rose of Tralee familiar and comforting. "Will you sing it?" Keaton asked quietly. "The whole song?" Violet glanced at him, surprised by the request. "You've heard it several times now." "And I'd hear it 100 more," he replied, his voice low and sincere. "You're singing. It reminds me that there's still beauty in this world." Something about his earnest expression made it impossible to refuse. Violet set her coffee aside and began to sing, her clear voice rising into the night air. She sang of love and beauty, of moonlight and roses, letting the familiar words carry her away from the worries of the day. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes to find Keaton watching her with such intensity that her breath caught in her throat. "Don't stop," he said softly, echoing his words from that first night. "I'll listen every night if you let me." The simple statement held a weight that transcended the moment, a promise of something neither had dared to name. Violet felt her heart beating wildly in her chest, aware that they had reached some invisible threshold. "Keaton," she began, unsure of what she wanted to say. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. Both were instantly alert, rising to their feet as a single rider approached at a gallop. "Get inside," Keaton said, his hand already on his revolver. "No," Violet replied firmly. "We face this together." Before Keaton could argue, the rider pulled up sharply before the porch, his horse breathing hard from exertion. In the fading light, Violet recognized young Billy Porter from the neighboring homestead. "Miss McKinnon," the boy called out, his voice high with urgency. "Pa sent me to warn you there's a group of men asking about your place down at Wade's Crossing, saying there's a rustler hiding out here." Keaton stepped forward. "How many men, Billy?" "6 or 7, the boy replied, eyeing Keaton nervously, mean-looking bunch. They were offering money for information. Violet exchanged a worried glance with Keaton. "Thank your father for us, Billy," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You should get home now before it gets too dark." As Billy rode away, Keaton turned to Violet, his expression grim. "You need to leave. Pack what you can carry and take the trail north to Rollins. I know people there who can help you." "Leave?" Violet stared at him incredulously. "This is my home, Keaton. I'm not abandoning it." "Those men won't care that this is your home," he argued. "They're looking for me, but they won't hesitate to hurt you if you get in their way." "Then you should be the one to leave," she countered, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. Keaton shook his head. "If I leave now, they'll think you were harboring me knowingly. They might still come after you." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Besides, I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because of me." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to address. Violet took a deep breath, forcing herself to think practically. "We have time," she said finally. "Wade's Crossing is a half-day's ride from here. They won't arrive until morning at the earliest." "Which gives us tonight to prepare," Keaton agreed, his expression thoughtful. "We could try to make a stand, but the odds aren't in our favor." "Or we could make them believe you've already gone," Violet suggested. "Leave an obvious trail heading west toward the mountains." Keaton considered this, nodding slowly. "It might work. I could ride out tonight, leave clear tracks, then circle back through the creek bed where I won't leave prints. Meanwhile, I'll stay here and act normally," Violet continued, warming to the plan. "If they come asking questions, I'll tell them you left yesterday after we argued about those men who came looking for you." "It's risky," Keaton warned. "If they don't believe you, they will," Violet said with more confidence than she felt. "I can be very convincing when necessary." Keaton studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but I won't go far. I'll hide in that stand of cottonwoods by the north pasture. If there's trouble, fire 3 shots in the air and I'll come running." As they made hasty preparations, gathering supplies and plotting Keaton's false trail, Violet tried to ignore the fear gnawing at her insides. The danger was real, but the thought of Keaton leaving even temporarily filled her with a different kind of dread. When the time came for him to depart, they stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly unsure in each other's presence. "Be careful," Violet said finally, breaking the silence. Keaton reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before dropping back to his side. You too. Remember 3 shots if there's trouble. I remember. He turned to go, then paused, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart skip. Violet, when this is over, there's something I need to tell you. Before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness with his horse. Violet stood on the porch long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, staring into the night and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Morning arrived with a crisp clarity that belied the tension in Violet's chest. She went about her chores with deliberate normalcy, feeding the chickens and milking the cow as if it were any other day. Only the loaded shotgun propped beside the door suggested otherwise. It was nearly noon when she heard them coming, multiple riders approaching at a steady pace from the east. Violet wiped her hands on her apron, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the porch to meet whatever was coming. 7 men rode into the yard, dust billowing around them. Buchanan led the group, his pockmarked face set in a hard expression as he surveyed the property. Behind him were Pike and Renfro from before, along with 4 strangers whose appearances did nothing to ease Violet's concerns. Miss McKinnon, Buchanan greeted her, tipping his hat with mock politeness. Lovely day, isn't it? State your business, Mr. Buchanan, Violet replied coolly. I'm rather busy. Buchanan dismounted, handing his reins to Pike. We're looking for your friend Dawson. Seems he and I have unfinished business. Mr. Dawson isn't here, Violet said, keeping her voice steady. He left yesterday. Is that so? Buchanan's tone made it clear he didn't believe her. Mind if we have a look around to confirm that? Actually, I do mind, Violet replied, her hand moving closer to the doorway where the shotgun waited. As I told you before, this is private property. One of the strangers laughed, a harsh sound that sent a chill down Violet's spine. Listen to her, boys. Little lady thinks she can give us orders. I think, Buchanan said, taking a step toward the porch, that you're protecting a criminal, Miss McKinnon. That makes you an accessory. I'm protecting nothing but my land, Violet countered. Keaton Dawson worked here briefly, yes. When I learned there were questions about his past, I asked him to leave. He rode west toward the mountains. Buchanan exchanged glances with his companions. Convenient story, got any proof? What kind of proof would satisfy you? Violet asked, fighting to keep her voice level. His personal belongings are gone, as is his horse. You're welcome to check the barn if you don't believe me. For a tense moment, she thought Buchanan might refuse, might order his men to search the house instead. Then he nodded to Pike and another man. Check the barn and outbuildings, thoroughly. While the men conducted their search, Buchanan remained near the porch, his calculating gaze never leaving Violet's face. You know, he said conversationally, harboring a fugitive is a serious offense, could get a person in a lot of trouble. Mr. Dawson is not here, Violet repeated firmly. And I'm not certain he's the fugitive you claim him to be. You've shown me no warrant, no official documentation of any kind. Buchanan's eyes narrowed. You seem mighty protective of a man you claim to have sent packing. I believe in justice, Mr. Buchanan. And I've seen no evidence that you represent it. Before he could respond, Pike and the other man returned from their search. No sign of him, boss, Pike reported. Horse is gone, no personal effects. Looks like she might be telling the truth. Relief washed through Violet, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. Buchanan looked displeased, his gaze scanning the horizon thoughtfully. When exactly did he leave? He asked, turning back to Violet. Yesterday afternoon, she replied. After you and your friends paid us a visit, I confronted him about your accusations. He denied them but agreed it would be best if he moved on. And which way did he go? West, as I said, mentioned something about heading to the mining camps near the mountains. Buchanan studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if she was lying. Finally, he nodded. All right, boys, looks like we've got some writing to do. He turned back to Violet, his expression hardening. If I find out you're lying to me, Miss McKinnon, I'll be back. And our next conversation won't be nearly so pleasant. Are you threatening me, Mr. Buchanan? Violet asked, her hand now resting on the doorframe inches from the shotgun. A cold smile spread across his face. Just stating facts, madam, just stating facts. With that, he remounted his horse and signaled to his men. As they rode away, heading west as Violet had suggested, she allowed herself to breathe again. The plan had worked, at least for now. But she harbored no illusions. If they didn't find Keaton's trail leading into the mountains, they would return, and they wouldn't be so easily convinced next time. Night fell without incident, and still Keaton hadn't returned. Violet paced the cabin, worrying that something had gone wrong. Had Buchanan's men found him? Had he decided it was safer to truly leave rather than return to her? The thought sent a pang through her heart that she couldn't ignore. A soft knock at the back door nearly stopped her heart. She grabbed the shotgun before cautiously approaching. Violet. Keaton's voice was low but unmistakable. "It's me." She unbarred the door with trembling hands, relief flooding through her at the sight of him standing there, whole and unharmed. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him, the shotgun clattering forgotten to the floor. Keaton stiffened in surprise, then his arms came around her, holding her close. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "I'm here." Violet pulled back, suddenly embarrassed by her impulsive action. "I was worried," she said simply, stepping away to retrieve the shotgun. "I saw them leave," Keaton said, following her into the cabin. "Heading west like we planned. Did they give you any trouble?" "Nothing I couldn't handle," Violet replied, setting the weapon aside. "They searched the barn but seemed to believe my story about you leaving yesterday." Keaton sank into a chair by the table, fatigue evident in the slump of his shoulders. "It won't last. Buchanan's not a fool. When they don't find my trail continuing into the mountains, they'll be back." "What do we do then?" Violet asked, pouring him a cup of coffee from the pot she'd kept warm on the stove. "I've been thinking about that," he said, accepting the cup gratefully. "The smart thing would be for me to actually leave, head east or north, somewhere they won't think to look." The thought of him leaving sent a wave of dismay through Violet, though she tried to hide it. "That might be best," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Except I don't want to go," Keaton continued, his voice soft but determined. "Not unless you come with me." Violet's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "What?" Keaton set down his coffee and rose, moving to stand before her. "I said there was something I needed to tell you when this was over. It isn't over yet, but I can't wait any longer." He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you, Violet McKinnon." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and terrifying in their honesty. Violet stared at him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know enough," he replied simply. "I know you're the strongest, most determined woman I've ever met. I know you sing like an angel and work harder than most men I've known. I know that when you smile, really smile, it lights up everything around you." His hand reached out, tentatively touching her cheek. "And I know that the thought of leaving you tears me apart inside." Violet leaned into his touch despite herself, her eyes closing briefly. "Keaton, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," he assured her. "But I need you to know how I feel, especially with things being so uncertain." His thumb traced gently along her cheekbone. "Whatever happens next, whatever you decide, I wanted you to know that." The sincerity in his eyes undid her. Violet had spent so long being strong, holding herself together through loss and hardship, that the tenderness of his confession nearly broke her. Without allowing herself to overthink, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration. Then Keaton's arms came around her, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened into something hungry and desperate. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, staring at each other in wonder. "I think," Violet said softly, "that I might be falling in love with you too." Joy blazed across Keaton's face, but before he could respond, the sound of a horse approaching at speed broke the moment. They moved as one, Keaton grabbing his revolver while Violet reached for the shotgun. "Stay back," Keaton warned, moving toward the window. Peering cautiously through the curtain, he relaxed slightly. "It's a single rider," he reported. "Coming hard, though." A moment later, a voice called out, "Hello, the house." "Miss McKinnon." Violet recognized the voice of Sheriff Taylor from Wade's Crossing. She exchanged a worried glance with Keaton. "What do we do?" she whispered. Keaton's jaw tightened. "I'll hide in the back room, see what he wants." Once Keaton was out of sight, Violet smoothed her hair, set aside the shotgun, and opened the door. Sheriff Taylor stood on her porch, his expression grave in the lamplight. "Evening, Sheriff," she greeted him, trying to keep her voice steady. "What brings you out this way so late?" "Bad news, I'm afraid," Taylor replied, removing his hat. "Mind if I come in?" Violet hesitated, acutely aware of Keaton hidden just a room away. "Actually, I was about to turn in. Could we speak out here?" Taylor nodded, though he looked slightly perplexed. "Very well, I'll be direct then. There was trouble in town earlier today. A group of men looking for a cattle rustler named Keaton Dawson." "Yes, they came here as well," Violet acknowledged. "I told them Mr. Dawson had already left." "That's partly why I'm here," Taylor said. "After they left your place, they got into an altercation with some cowboys from the Diamond D ranch in town. Things got ugly." He paused, his expression somber. "Two men are dead, Miss McKinnon. One of them was Frank Buchanan." Shock rendered Violet momentarily speechless. "Dead." She finally managed. "How?" "Gunfight outside the saloon," Taylor explained. "Buchanan accused one of the Diamond D boys of helping Dawson escape. Words were exchanged, then bullets." He sighed heavily. "In the aftermath, some interesting information came to light. Seems Buchanan wasn't exactly who he claimed to be." "What do you mean?" Violet asked, her mind racing. "He was wanted in Colorado for theft and impersonating a lawman," Taylor said. "The men with him weren't representing any legitimate cattle association. They were bounty hunters, and not particularly scrupulous ones at that." Hope flared in Violet's chest. "And what about their accusations against Keaton Dawson?" Taylor shrugged. "I've sent telegrams to verify, but preliminary information suggests Dawson may have been falsely accused. Seems a man named Buddy McLaren implicated him in a rustling operation last year when McLaren was caught red-handed. Was trying to reduce his own sentence by naming accomplices." "And you believed him?" Violet couldn't keep the indignation from her voice. "I didn't believe anything yet," Taylor said mildly. "That's why I'm investigating." He studied her curiously. "You seem quite concerned about Dawson's reputation for someone who barely knew him." Violet felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I dislike injustice, Sheriff, Mr. Dawson worked honestly for me, and I'd hate to think he was being hunted for crimes he didn't commit." Taylor nodded slowly. "Well, if you happen to hear from him, let him know I'd like to speak with him, not to arrest him, just to clarify some details." He replaced his hat. "And Miss McKinnon. Be careful. The rest of Buchanan's men scattered after the shooting, but they might still be in the area." After the sheriff departed, Violet closed the door and leaned against it, her mind whirling with the implications of what she'd just learned. Keaton emerged from the back room, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Did I hear that correctly?" he asked. "Buchanan's dead. And apparently he wasn't who he claimed to be," Violet confirmed. "The sheriff thinks you might have been falsely accused." A weight seemed to lift from Keaton's shoulders. "Buddy," he said quietly. "He named me to save his own skin." There was hurt in his voice, the pain of betrayal by someone he had once considered a friend. Violet moved to him, taking his hands in hers. "The sheriff wants to speak with you. He said it wasn't to arrest you, just to clarify details." Keaton nodded thoughtfully. "I should go to him tomorrow, clear this up once and for all." He squeezed her hands gently. "But tonight?" The unspoken question hung between them, laden with possibility and promise. Violet felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "Tonight you should stay here," she said softly. "Where you belong." The next morning they rode to Wade's Crossing together, the spring sunshine casting long shadows across the prairie. Violet couldn't help but notice how different Keaton looked, not physically, but in his demeanor. The constant wariness that had shadowed him since Buchanan's first appearance had eased, replaced by a cautious optimism. Sheriff Taylor received them in his office, his eyebrows rising slightly at their arrival together, but making no comment. The conversation was lengthy, with Keaton providing details about his past association with Buddy McLaren and his whereabouts during the time of the alleged cattle rustling. "I was working at the Lazy S Ranch near Laramie during those months," Keaton explained. "The foreman, Jim Sellers, can verify it." Taylor made notes, nodding. "I'll send a telegram to confirm, but your story matches what I've been able to piece together so far." He leaned back in his chair, studying Keaton thoughtfully. McLaren's testimony is looking less credible by the day. He's named at least 3 other men who have solid alibis for the rustling. Relief washed over Keaton's face. So I'm not wanted. Not by any legitimate law enforcement that I can determine, Taylor confirmed. Though I'd advise staying in the area until we get final confirmation from the territorial marshal's office. As they left the sheriff's office, Violet felt as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The spring air seemed fresher, the sunlight brighter as they walked down the main street of the small settlement. "What happens now?" she asked, glancing up at Keaton. He took her hand, a public gesture that would certainly set tongues wagging in the small community. "That depends on you," he said quietly. "I meant what I said last night, Violet. I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Violet's heart swelled at the sincerity in his eyes. For so long, she had focused solely on survival, keeping the ranch going, honoring her brother's memory. The possibility of happiness, of love, had seemed a distant luxury she couldn't afford. Yet here it was, offered freely by this man who had appeared on her doorstep and changed everything. "The ranch needs a lot of work," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "It's a big commitment." Keaton's answering smile was radiant. "I'm not afraid of hard work, and there's nowhere else I'd rather be than by your side." Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold, Violet leaned against Keaton's shoulder, a contentment she had almost forgotten could exist settling deep in her bones. "Sing for me," Keaton requested softly, his arm around her waist. Violet smiled, remembering that first night when he had emerged from the darkness, drawn by her voice. So much had changed since then, yet the simple pleasure of sharing music remained. She began to sing, her clear voice carrying across the open prairie as darkness gathered around them. Keaton listened, his expression one of rapt attention and deep affection. When she finished, he pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "I'll never tire of hearing you sing," he murmured. "Every night for the rest of our lives, if you'll let me." "I think that can be arranged," Violet replied, turning to meet his lips with her own. In the weeks that followed, official word arrived from the territorial marshal confirming Keaton's innocence. The remaining members of Buchanan's group had been apprehended trying to run a similar scheme in another county, effectively closing that chapter of uncertainty. Spring blossomed into summer, and the McKinnon Ranch, now unofficially the McKinnon Dawson Ranch, began to thrive under their combined efforts. Fields that had lain fallow since Thomas's death were planted with wheat and corn. The cattle herd grew as new calves were born and protected from predators by the now solid fence line. And in late August, under an arch of wildflowers with Sheriff Taylor officiating and neighbors from surrounding homesteads in attendance, Violet and Keaton were married. The celebration afterward was modest but joyful, with fiddle music and dancing continuing well into the night. As the last guests departed, Keaton swept his new wife into his arms on the porch where they had first met. "Happy, Mrs. Dawson?" he asked, his eyes twinkling in the lamplight. "Deliriously," Violet replied, her arms around his neck. "Though I do have one request." "Anything," he promised. "Will you listen to me sing? Not just tonight, but every night." Keaton's expression softened with love. "Until the stars fall from the sky," he vowed. "I told you that first night I'll listen every night if you let me. That's a promise I intend to keep." And as they stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, Violet began to sing not a song of longing or separation, but one of love fulfilled and promises kept. Her voice, clear and true, carried across the land they both now called home, a beacon in the gathering darkness, a testament to the unexpected joy that had found them both when they least expected it. 5 years later, the McKinnon Dawson Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the territory. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper house with 3 bedrooms, a necessity after the arrival of their twins, Thomas and Elizabeth, now 3 years old and full of boundless energy. The barn had been rebuilt, larger and sturdier than before, housing not only livestock, but also the workshop where Keaton crafted furniture during the winter months, a skill he had discovered he possessed and enjoyed. On a warm summer evening, Violet stood on the porch, watching as Keaton played with the children in the yard. Thomas, already showing his father's height and adventurous spirit, was attempting to rope a makeshift target, while Elizabeth, with her mother's auburn hair and determined nature, instructed her brother on proper technique, despite being the younger by 7 minutes. The sight filled Violet with contentment so profound it almost hurt. From the lonely, struggling woman she had been when Keaton first appeared on her doorstep to the fulfilled wife and mother, she was now the transformation sometimes seemed like a dream. "Mama." Elizabeth called, spotting her on the porch. "Come see, I can throw the rope just like Papa showed me." Violet descended the steps, joining her family in the yard. "Show me, sweetheart," she encouraged, ruffling her daughter's curls. As Elizabeth demonstrated her nascent roping skills with intense concentration, Keaton moved to Violet's side, slipping an arm around her waist. "She has your determination," he murmured, pride evident in his voice. "And your stubbornness," Violet countered with a smile. "I prefer to call it persistence," Keaton replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "It's served us well, hasn't it?" Violet couldn't argue with that. Their persistence had built this life together through drought and blizzard, through difficult harvests and challenging markets. Through it all, their partnership had only strengthened, each challenge faced together making them more resilient. Later, after the children were tucked into bed with stories of brave cowboys and clever frontier women, Violet and Keaton sat on the porch in what had become their nightly ritual. No matter how busy or tiring the day had been, they always found time for this moments of quiet togetherness as darkness settled over the land. "I received a letter from Jim today," Keaton said, referring to his former foreman from the Lazy S who had become a friend over the years. "He's finally retiring, moving to California to live with his daughter." "That's a long journey at his age," Violet remarked. "Will he travel by train?" "Part of the way," Keaton nodded. "He asked if we might visit someday. Says the ocean is something everyone should see at least once in their lives." Violet considered this, trying to imagine a body of water so vast you couldn't see across it. "Perhaps when the children are older," she suggested. "I think they'd enjoy such an adventure." "And you?" Keaton asked, studying her face in the fading light. "Would you enjoy it?" Violet smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Any adventure with you is one worth having." Contentment settled between them, comfortable and familiar. Then, as she had nearly every night for the past 5 years, Violet began to sing. The songs had changed over time, sometimes lullabies for the children, sometimes ballads she remembered from her youth, sometimes new melodies that seemed to create themselves as she sang. Tonight, she returned to "The Rose of Tralee," the song that had first drawn Keaton to her. Her voice, made richer by years of happiness, and the occasional sorrow, carried the familiar melody into the night. Keaton listened, his expression one of complete attention, as enraptured by her singing now as he had been that first evening. When she finished, he took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the song?" Violet asked, though she knew that wasn't all he meant. "For everything," Keaton clarified. "For letting me stay when you had every reason to send me away, for believing in me when others didn't, for building this life with me." His eyes, warm in the lamplight, held hers. "For singing every night just as I asked." Violet cupped his cheek, the familiar contours of his face as dear to her as her own reflection. "I seem to recall you making a promise to listen," she reminded him. "Every night, you said. A promise I've been happy to keep," Keaton assured her, turning his face to kiss her palm again. "And we'll continue to keep for all our days together." As stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Violet leaned forward to kiss her husband, gratitude filling her heart for the unexpected twist of fate that had brought this wandering cowboy to her doorstep. What had begun with a simple song had grown into a love that sustained them both, a harmony more beautiful than any melody she could sing. And in the quiet of the evening, as Keaton held her close, Violet knew with absolute certainty that of all the songs she had ever sung, or would sing in the future, this one, the story of their love, would always be the sweetest.